Hey, welcome to this week's study guide. We are continuing in a series called The Screen Test. And this week's message title is Duck Lip Hypocrisy. What kind of message title is that? I don't know who came up with that, but he ought to be whipped. Well, anyway, here we go. We are thinking about social media, all the media that's out there, the things that we're inundated with, the temptation to be a hypocrite online and the temptation to be influenced by those who are hypocritical. And so we find that the Bible doesn't talk about social media, but again, the Bible gives us certain principles by which we have to live our life, which certainly apply to things like social media. Today's passage came from James, and let me share that with you. It comes from James chapter 3, verse 13. By the way, there's a great 3:16 in this passage, and we preached out of one last week. And so James chapter 3, verse 13, we're going to go through 18. Let me read that with you, and then we'll get right into the questions. Here we go. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such, quote, wisdom, unquote, does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder in every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. I want you to see here, there's two types of wisdom. There's wisdom that comes from above and wisdom that comes from below. In other words, wisdom that comes from heaven and wisdom that comes from the pit of hell. One shows up in humility. One shows up in not envying. The other demonstrates itself by envying and by being self-seeking and self-absorbed. And so, when you think about social media, we find that both of those things can happen at the same time. There's a lot of good uses, but there's also a lot of bad. Let's talk about the bad for a moment. In the bad, we find out, and we talked about this on Sunday morning, that there are lots of new mental issues that, or social issues that come out of social media. Some things like fear of being left out or fear of missing out. Fear of not measuring up to other people that you see on social media. On the other side of that are people who live hypocritically because they're self-promoting, because they're arrogant, because they're wanting people to think better of them than they really are. That's an insincerity, which we find in this passage is not something that we should have. And so, thinking about those things, let's get right into our questions. Here we go. Question number 1. How easy is it to be a hypocrite online? Now remember, a hypocrite is one that has a false face, a mask. How easy is it to be a hypocrite online? Talk about that. Well, we see that online we can put filters on our face, and by the way, there's no filter on my face, obviously. We can make our hair a different color. We can make sure that we get just the right mix, just the right lighting, just the right circumstance, and put out there things that are really mythical, that aren't real. And so it's easy to be a hypocrite online. It's much easier to be a hypocrite online than it is in person. And so when we're thinking about hypocrisy, we think about those people who shoot those selfies, put their lips out, and they make it look like their lives are just fantastic. They could be in the middle of pure hell, and they can pause and take a selfie and convince you that everything's great. It's easy to be a hypocrite online. Second question. Here we go. How tempting is it to be envious of those whom we see online? How tempting is it to be envious of those whom we see online? Well, again, scientists are discovering, sociologists are discovering, psychologists are discovering that many people see these things online, see these people in their hypocrisy, and fail to filter out what might be going on. They fail to see the truth. Therefore, they sit at home or they sit in their offices, they see these things, and they become envious. They feel like they're failures. They feel like, oh, what about the blemishes on my face? My circumstances don't measure up to that. And so when we see the hypocrisy and we don't filter through that, it's very tempting for us to despair over our circumstances. Listen to me, folks. Nobody has it perfect. rich people can be miserable. There are more divorces amongst rich people in Hollywood than there are down in your neighborhood. And so remember that we don't need to be envious of this false reality that we see online. Let's go to our third question. Here we go. How does James 3:16 speak to both of these problems? But James 3:16 gives us what real wisdom looks like and what false wisdom looks like. And so as we present ourselves online, as we present ourselves to the world, we need to make sure that we're doing it with heavenly wisdom, not with earthly wisdom. I'm not going to go through all that because you have it in James from this morning's message. But nonetheless, we need to make sure that we follow worldly wisdom in two ways. One, when we're watching online and seeing what's happening, and the other is when we're presenting online. And so we need to follow heavenly wisdom, not worldly wisdom. Let's go on to our next question. Here we go. Can you summarize the difference between what we talked about in the message between what I would call wisdom, W-I-S-D-U-M-B, and wisdom, W-I-S-D-O-M? Can you differentiate between the two that are drawn from this passage out of James? Well, let me just give you a brief synopsis. Wisdom that comes from hell is bitterly envious, selfishly ambitious, results in disorder, and leads to evil deeds. And so when we're selfishly ambitious, wanting people to see us, when we're envious of those whom we see, that leads to disorder and evil deeds. That's wisdom. Wisdom that comes from heaven is pure, peace-loving, considerate, submissive, merciful, fruitful, impartial, and most of all, it's sincere. It has no hypocrisy. Let's go to the last question today. I hope that you've enjoyed this discussion. Here's a good one for you. What do you think James would say to us in the social media culture today based upon what he's saying to the early church? What do you think he'd say to us today? So there you have it. James, in these timeless principles, speaks to us. We're to have wisdom from above, not seek the wisdom from this world that ultimately comes from the pit of hell. We're not to be selfish and ambitious, and we're certainly not to be envious. And so when we're thinking about living online, seeing online, let us be sincere. And let us make sure that we know when others are being sincere or not being sincere. Let us seek to have heavenly wisdom to guide us through our media age, through social media, so that we can be pleasing to God. God bless you. Thanks for joining us today. Enjoy your week.